Okay, so in the last video, we talked about the social changes that happened during the Progressive era, and now we're going to talk about like the political side and the business side, which are kind of intertwined, and how those things kind of change during this time period too, during the Progressive era. So probably one of the biggest changes that we see for the very first time is the Socialist Party that forms. So actually this really forms in the late 1800s. A guy named Eugene Debs is really the first Socialist Party leader. He runs for president several times, but they believe in public ownership of railroads and factories. They take on a lot of ideas from the populists, kind of democratic control of the economy itself. They attract a lot of the urban immigrants, Western farmers, and miners at this time. And this kind of shows you where the populists were at that time period. Move out of the way there, but where they actually had a socialist mayor. So it actually grows around this time period. Right along with the socialists are the labor unions, and I say that because a lot of people in the labor unions are socialists. And so there were two major labor unions at the time, the AFL and the IWW. The AFL stands for the American Federation of Labor, and the IWW is International Workers of the World. AFL is still here today, actually, and Samuel Gompers is the one that leads that. There's actually a statue of Samuel Gompers, downtown San Antonio today. He's much more, they were much more moderate, but they were really restrictive. They only allowed certain types of people, white, male, native born. The IWW allows everybody in, right? It was very similar to the Knights of Labor that we learned about, much more militant and radical. William Haywood is the one that really runs this. It's known, he wants like a workers' revolution, and he really almost single-handedly runs many, many strikes. We're going to talk about the IWW in more detail when we talk about the social issues of the teens and 20s. But, they start organizing and striking. But they also look very, very militant. And after the Bolshevik Revolution, the Russian Revolution in 1917, people are just going to assume that people in the labor union are communists. Some of them were, and anarchists. Okay, so we also had progressive politics happening at the time. So people wanted to see changes happen because they don't think politics were fair at the time. So one of the things that actually happens is the passage of the 17th Amendment. So you may or may not know this, but in the original Constitution, the way that you get U.S. senators was that the state legislatures actually elected them. So that means that the only people that you have the voice of are the House of Representatives and the president through an electoral system, right? But there was this push, and this was again from the populists. They wanted to push this idea of directly the people electing the senators. And this is pushed through, and this becomes an amendment. And so now that's why today we elect our senators. Okay, so finally, women. Suffrage, right? The campaign really began in 1848 with the Seneca Falls Convention. And really at the time, this is really important to really think about. At the time, half of the states allowed women to vote at the time. So half of the states really allowed women to vote already. But women really wanted to see but women's suffrage was trickling in little by little. Women wanted to see a whole overhaul, the whole country get suffrage. So this was really important to them, and they want to push to do that, to get a constitutional amendment. This is finally passed in 1919, becomes ratified in August 18th of 1920. And yes, it was 100 years last year of women's suffrage, right? 100 years of voting. And so we'll get into more depth with when we get to talk about the 1920s and the Roaring Twenties, because with the flapper, a lot of changes are going to happen for women. But I think I do have this map that really shows you before the constitutional amendment was passed, how many states already had full suffrage. Really, a lot of them in the West. And this tells you women were allowed to vote maybe in school board elections and little things like that. But interesting that the original colonies took longer to really have that freedom. Okay, shifting gears, we're going to talk a lot about these three presidents, and they're known as the progressive presidents because great change happened. The presidents that were around during the Gilded Age, we didn't talk about them much because they didn't do much, right? There wasn't a lot about them. McKinley, that maybe, and we'll talk about him when we talk about imperialism soon. But we're going to talk about these three presidents, Teddy Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson. All three of them implemented different types of progressive reforms. Um, Taft and Teddy Roosevelt were both Republicans, and Wilson was a Democrat. And we'll talk a lot about Wilson more too when we talk about World War One, because he was president during World War One. So Teddy was like the original progressive president. He's known as the trust buster because he busted up monopolies. That was like a really big thing that he wanted to do. And his idea was something called the square deal. And there were 3 C's in the square deal. I know, a lot of students are like, why isn't it 4? Square meant fair. Okay, that's what it kind of meant at that time, so that's why they named it square. But anyway, conservation of natural resources. He's going to be the first one to really care about the environment. Control of corporations, there's all kinds of trust busting, and consumer protection. Just like we talked about in the last video, he is the one that pushes for the Meat Inspection Act and the Food and Drug Administration. Okay, so he'll become like what's known as the trust buster. So like I said, Teddy was and by the way, he's the first president to use his initials, TR. Just so you know, like we use GW and other ones from the past, but the first one to really do it was Teddy Roosevelt. But anyway, he was a nature lover. If you know anything about Teddy or have ever seen anything about Teddy, he was like a rugged outdoorsman. Interestingly enough, he was actually, Teddy was like a really skinny child, sickly child, had asthma, and so he almost wanted to prove himself. So he is a nature lover. He meets up with our very first American environmentalist, a guy named John Muir. Muir Woods out in the western part of the United States in California is named after him. He creates Yosemite Park, Yellowstone National Park. He's responsible for all of that. But Teddy and John Muir knew each other very well, and John Muir pushed Teddy to make a lot of environmental changes. Teddy was more for responsible use of natural resources. John Muir, by the way, he founded the Sierra Club. John Muir did. He's not quite that radical, but he's the first one to really implement any kind of like environmental changes. And so John Muir and Teddy, they come through and make a lot of changes. Like I said, Yosemite National Park, Muir founded like the Sierra Club, and 1905 Teddy creates the U.S. Forest Service. So lots of environmental changes happening there. Okay, so Taft, now a lot of you may know Taft as a Supreme Court justice. That's why Northside High School is named after him. And that's really what he wanted to do. But that comes later, actually, after his presidency. He was like really groomed by Teddy. Teddy would have run longer. Teddy actually becomes president because McKinley was assassinated and he was his vice president. And interestingly enough, even though Teddy was nicknamed the Trust Buster, Taft actually broke up more trust than he did. And this is a really interesting picture of Teddy passing the baby, his policies, over to Taft, and that was really what he wanted to do. Taft, however, didn't really care for the environment like Teddy did. He was not the great outdoorsman. And he removes a lot of the forest reserves that Teddy had set up. And so there were some other things that Taft does too. He supports like an 8-hour workday. He thought the presidential power needed to be reined in, where Teddy thought the president needed to have more power. And there's all kinds of reasons why there starts to be a rift between Teddy and Taft. And it really was because Teddy was expecting Taft to use all of his policies. And Taft has a mind of his own and doesn't necessarily think that his policies were the only way to go. And so this actually creates a huge split in the political party, in the Republican political party. So much that Teddy Roosevelt was really angry and wanted to run for president in the second term instead of Taft running, wanted the Republicans to nominate him. They wouldn't nominate him. They nominated Taft. This makes him really angry, and he forms his own political party known as the Progressive Party or the Bull Moose Party. Of course, what is that going to do? That's going to split the votes in the Republican Party. And what happens when that happens? That means that a Democrat easily came in and became the next president, which is how Wilson became president at the time. Okay, so because of that split in the Republican Party, then you have Wilson. And like I said, we're going to talk about Wilson quite a bit more because he's the president that leads America through World War I. But he believed in this idea of a new freedom. He continues with the trust reforms. Okay, so all three of them are trust busting. He also continues, even though Taft didn't, the environmental protections. And so he creates the National Park Service, which is still around today, in 1916. So he continues that. He was really focused more on like financial reform. He was actually an economist, at a college, I believe Princeton. And during his presidency too, the 16th Amendment was passed, graduated income tax, which was also an idea of the progressives. He creates, the populists. He creates the Federal Trade Commission, FTC, that's still around, and the Federal Reserve Act, which was supposed to be created to help banks not fail. That we know that doesn't happen because in 1929 we had the stock market crash. But even today we still have the Federal Reserve System. Okay, so that's all I've got for you for the progressives. I know that was quite a bit of information, but one of the reasons why this is so important for us to understand is because all of this is going to lay the groundwork for what's going to happen in the future in the 1920s. And it's going to make a lot more sense if you understand the progressives and what was going on, these changes that were happening at the time. All right, have a great week. Talk to you soon.